Arguably, the most impressive and well-known story ever told in human history is that of Joseph, found in the sacred scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It has been read and narrated for thousands of years, and that remains the case across civilizations till this day. An often overlooked element of the story of Joseph is that it is closely connected with the story of another well-known and revered prophetic figure, Moses. With Joseph begins the initial entry of the children of Israel into Egypt. And with Moses is their exodus just a few generations later. The narrative has appealed to, and has inspired, billions of people throughout history. Yet the historical accuracy of this amazing account remained uncertain, that is, until recently. When we compare widely acknowledged historical accounts of key figures and events in ancient Egypt to the Quranic narrative, we find that Imhotep, the notorious and renowned vizier of King Djoser, the first king of the Old Kingdom, appears to be none other than Joseph himself. Khufu, aka Cheops, a very famous ruler of ancient Egypt, whose reign is estimated to have begun in 2589 BC, appears to be the pharaoh mentioned in the Qur'an. Hemi-Unu, also known as Haman, Khufu's vizier and chief architect, strongly resembles Haman, a man mentioned in the Qur'an as the pharaoh's most trusted advisor. Now let's examine the accounts given to us in the scriptures alongside the historical and archaeological evidence available to us now and see what overlaps we find. After being thrown in a well by his own brothers and taken by a caravan to Egypt, Joseph ends up as a slave in the house of the vizier of Egypt. When Joseph becomes mature, God grants Joseph wisdom and knowledge, which we observe being manifested in many different ways throughout his story. Here's just some of what historians now know about Imhotep. He was a polymath, an architect, physician, engineer, a sage, and perhaps the first genius in recorded history. He was the first master architect known by name and the architect of the first pyramid ever built, the Step Pyramid, in Saqqara. He is the first person known to have used columns to support a building. He's the first physician known to have rejected magic and used science to heal, which is why he's been credited with being the founder of medicine. When the vizier's wife realizes that she can't have her way with Joseph, she has him imprisoned. Then a few years pass and the king has an alarming dream, and no one is able to interpret it but Joseph, who's still imprisoned. So Joseph is requested to interpret the dream and eventually gains his freedom as a result. Joseph says that the dream means that Egypt will face 7 years of high yield, followed by 7 years of drought. According to the famine stela, an ancient inscription carved in stone near Aswan in Egypt, there was a 7-year famine during King Djoser's reign. It tells us the story of how Imhotep came to King Djoser in his 18th year and interpreted his dream. Next, upon Joseph's insistence, the king summons the women who schemed against Joseph, and they confess to their crime and his innocence. Joseph is then put in charge of Egypt's treasury. As it happens, the first of Imhotep's official titles was the treasurer of the king. He even kept track of the king's personal wealth. While implicit in the Quranic narrative, the Bible explicitly states that Joseph was tasked with the responsibility of saving Egypt from the famine. The story recorded in the famine stela also credits Imhotep as being instrumental in ending the famine. The Quran suggests that the king grew extremely fond of Joseph and implies that the two were very close. Before he even meets him, he announces that he will appoint Joseph exclusively for himself. And after he finally speaks to him, he immediately appoints him to one of the highest offices in the country. Imhotep was so close to the king that he even had Imhotep's name and titles carved into his own statues. Joseph was not an Egyptian by birth, nor was he related to the king in any way. It was through his wisdom and ability to interpret dreams that he rose to the second most powerful position in all of Egypt. Imhotep, as it turns out, was a commoner by birth, who advanced to one of the highest and most influential positions in Egypt through his natural talents. This, it should be noted, was not typical in ancient Egypt. Viziers and other high-ranking officials were usually the other members of the king's family, and Imhotep appears to be the only notable exception. Eventually, the brothers reunite with Joseph and the whole family settles in Egypt. According to the Bible, the grandfather of Moses, Kohath, was among those of Joseph's family who settled in Egypt. Though it is only hinted in the Quran, through the Bible's outline of Moses' genealogy, we know that only 3 generations separate Joseph and Moses. This means that Joseph and Moses lived no more than 100 years apart. Recall we said in our introduction that the Pharaoh Khufu closely resembles the Pharaoh of the Qur'an. The first major clue is that Khufu lived and ruled right around the time we'd expect, approximately 60 to 100 years after Djoser and Imhotep. The Pharaoh of the Qur'an is the only person mentioned in the book who explicitly declares himself to be God. Pharaoh said, "I am your Lord Most High." According to prominent Egyptologists like Sahih Hawass and Rainer Stadelman, there is strong evidence indicating that Khufu not only declared himself to be Ra, the creator god worshipped in ancient Egypt, but that he was the first, and probably the only, ruler of Egypt to have done so. Elsewhere in the Quran, Pharaoh suggests that not only is he God, but that he's the only one the Egyptians should worship. "O notables, I know of no god for you other than myself." Pharaoh said, "Truly if you take a god apart from me, I shall place you among the imprisoned." 3 findings about Khufu suggest that he tried to enforce his new cult, in which he was the only god to be worshipped. Khufu did not make any offerings to the gods, as was the custom of the Egyptian rulers, indicating that he equaled himself with God. Khufu didn't build any temples for other gods, which was the norm for rulers of ancient Egypt. Egyptologists suggest he may have dismissed the priests at Heliopolis and organized his own cult at Giza. Throughout the Quran, Pharaoh is portrayed as an evil, rebellious, deceptive ruler who is completely obsessed with his own power and oppresses whoever refuses to accept him as their god. He's probably the single most evil and ruthless human being mentioned in the book. While modern historians tend to be skeptical about Khufu's reputation among the ancients, he was well known to be cruel, heretical, and a heartless despot to the ancient Greeks, Persians, and the Egyptians. Interestingly enough, Sahih Hawass suggests that Khufu's claiming to be Ra, the god himself, might actually explain all the bad publicity found about him later on. Although the Qur'an doesn't state this, the Bible mentions that Pharaoh's firstborn son was killed in one of the plagues of Egypt. Khufu's eldest son and crown prince, Khuab, also died quite young, during the reign of his father. According to the Qur'an, Pharaoh's right-hand man and most trusted aide was a man named Haman. Khufu's vizier and chief justice happened to be a man named Hemi-Unu, also pronounced Haman. In his opposition to Moses and his demand for the release of the children of Israel from bondage and oppression, Pharaoh commands Haman to build him a tower on which he could ascend to the heavens. And Pharaoh said, "O Haman, build for me a tower, that perhaps I may attain the means to reach the heavens, they may look upon the God of Moses. Truly, I deem him a liar." Khufu is best known for building the Great Pyramid of Giza, which he believed was his stairway to heaven. And guess who the chief architect was? None other than Haman himself. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. In fact, the Great Pyramid was originally known as the Horizon of Khufu, because Khufu claimed to be the sun god Ra, whose natural location was on the horizon. For those who may be wondering, where's Khufu's body? Doesn't the Quran say that God will preserve Pharaoh's body for all future generations to see as a sign? And don't we already have the body of Ramses II? It should be noted that the verse that speaks about the preservation of Pharaoh's bodies was never interpreted like this prior to the discovery of the various mummies of the rulers of ancient Egypt. The classical opinion on this verse, based on a narration from Ibn Abbas and other classical scholars, was that God kept Pharaoh's body intact and commanded the sea to throw it out so that those among the children of Israel who doubted his death could be certain. This was specifically a sign for the children of Israel, but not necessarily for all future generations. So, to conclude, historians and biblical scholars have known for decades that Imhotep bears a striking resemblance to Joseph, but they could never be sure, particularly since the chronology derived from the Old Testament seems to be off by nearly 1,000 years. The Qur'an, however, solves this issue and solidifies this theory. It can be said with confidence that not only was Imhotep Joseph, but Haman was the same Haman mentioned in the Qur'an, and Khufu was Pharaoh himself. The close resemblance of the major details given in the Qur'an and the established history of this time period is truly worth pondering over.